Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Rent to Rent Success podcast today. I have a special guest, Mr. Tsen Wharton, and I know that you are going to love Tsen's story. Tsen is an experienced property investor. He's been investing since 2007 and just back doing buy-to-lets and HMOs. And then just back in 2016, he started in rent to rent. There's one story about where things did not go so well, but now Tsen has created his system for predictable property profits, and he's published a book all about that too. And we're here to share what Tsen's new strategy is. And also something that I'm hugely interested in is how to do serviced accommodation effectively throughout this whole coronavirus. And Tsen has got a unique take on that, which I'm excited for him to share with you. So welcome to the show today, Mr. Tsen Wharton, Rent to Rent Rockstar.
Thank you, Stephanie, for such a nice and flattering introduction.
Pleasure. I'm so pleased that you could be here. I first heard you on the George and Sarah Choi podcast, and I was blown away by not only the strategy that you've taken to be really successful within service accommodation just at the moment, while things have been very difficult for a lot of service accommodation providers. So I'm excited for you to share that with people today. But let's start off a little bit earlier than that and talk about, why did you first get into property?
Why?
Mm-hmm.
Big question, roundabout kind of way to get to it. Hopefully I'll try and shrink it down so as not to bore anyone, but I need to take you way back to probably early 2000s, 2004, and I'm in my first career in London in media sales, having a great time. But even after being in my first job, post-graduating, post-traveling for a year and all that good stuff, there was something about it that I wasn't feeling fulfilled. I was still searching for something else. And that period of the mid-2000s, back in my 20s, I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but looking back on it now, have I lost you there, Stephanie?
No, I'm still here.
You're still there. I just lost your screen. But trying to put my finger on it now, looking back, I realized that I didn't feel like I belonged as an employee. I was looking for something else, something a bit more entrepreneurial. And I think what I wanted back then was to start my own business in some way. I just didn't know in what or how. But to answer your question about why property, it was in searching for answers, looking for ways to, I guess, be in business and have a secondary income that might at some point free me of the need to be an employee. I stumbled across the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which was a seminal book for me. I know it is for many others in the property community. And that really just lit up a load of light bulbs in my head. It made a lot of sense. And from that point onwards, 2004, I started figuring out how I might get started. And it wasn't until that 2006, 2007 time that you mentioned that I started to actually look to invest in property and figure things out as I went, just slow and uncertain, just like everyone else when they're getting started. But I was keen to get going. So that was kind of the beginning point, and it just grew in terms of the interest to me and the, I guess, the refining of the process and the results as I went to the next one and the next one from there.
Brilliant. And I know from a little chat earlier that you started off buying single buy-to-lets, and then you moved on into HMOs. So there you were with a portfolio of buy-to-lets and HMOs. What made you decide to start up in rent to rent?
So the point you got to there, we're talking about 2015. I had grown a portfolio the kind of slow and steady way. Mm-hmm. It was very much kind of the tortoise wins the race, nothing overly exciting and sexy, but a few good deals here and there, some commercial conversions to make flats and HMOs, but slow and steady. But I'd got myself to a position of being financially independent. I was free of employment and very much reflecting on, yes, this is great, but if I was to continue at this kind of pace, I was never going to reach the kind of abundance I was dreaming of. It's a big difference between financially independent and financially abundant, and all the other things I wanted to create in my life, my family, myself. So again, I started looking for answers, and I felt like I'd hit a real ceiling with where I'd got to, Stephanie. And so looking for ways to accelerate things in property, I'll tell you, actually, it came from reading an article in YPN, Your Property Network.
Oh,
I've been reading that pretty much religiously since 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
So it's nearly since it began. And I found an article in there about a couple who are from Scotland and were doing great things in property. And I sought them out actively. And fast forwarding to 2016, when I actually started mentorship with them, this is Paul and Annika Smith, a strategy that they were teaching at the time was service accommodation. And so that's really what exposed me to service accommodation, seeing what had been done by a mentor and asking questions, think, well, yeah, I could do that with my business partner, Chris, we could do that. And so spring 2016 is when we got started, thanks to the, I guess, the guidance from mentors at the time.
That's phenomenal. It's so inspiring, isn't it, when you're working with people who've really done so well, and you then see the path to be able to emulate their success. And I know that you were saying earlier that when you first started with Rent to Rent, it wasn't as successful, but then you evolved into something which was. So tell us a little bit about that first misstep.
Yeah, absolutely. So you absolutely referred to it right in the same way I look at it. I see there's two stories of service accommodation, two tales of service accommodation for me, my business partner, Chris. And the first one was one of failure. And I've got no hang-ups or qualms about sharing why and all the lessons from it, because I think it's valuable for other people to hear that and read about it. But the reason why it was unsuccessful largely boils down to the fact that it was a business built on hope and guesswork. Quite simply, foundations of sand, which we all know, probably in hindsight, that that's not a good business model going forwards. And I'll tell you a bit about what I mean here. When we think of service accommodation, many of us just jump to the fact that, okay, what that might look like is, in the rent-to-rent world, we rent a property off the open market in an area that we think's going to appeal to tourists, and we'll put adverts up on booking.com and Airbnb, and people will come and people will fill the property and we'll make lots of money in the middle. Why wouldn't we? And for me, especially, I thought this had to be the case because we were targeting the central EH1 postcode of our capital city, the beautiful Edinburgh. I don't know if you've ever been to Edinburgh before.
I lived in Edinburgh for 15 years.
You lived there for 15 years, even better, so you know it inside out. So West End of Edinburgh, prime EH1 postcode. We've got year-long tourism. We've got the big booming festival. Well, not this year, but most Augusts we have the festival for a month, where the population swells to double, massive student population, parents traveling in and out. We've got, it's the UK's largest or second largest financial services centre, second to London, because of all the big HQs of banks and FS organisations. So the expectation of someone like me getting started was that of all the places in the UK, you can't go wrong in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Well, you can go wrong in Edinburgh if you get things a bit wrong and you just base things on guesswork. And so what happened was we got the first property up and running. We literally probably rented the first property off the agent and landlord that were willing to work with us in this fashion of rent to rent, and spent probably too much on it to redecorate it for the landlord, semi-furnish it because it was part furnished, get adverts up, and then have someone manage the check-ins for us. And of course, we launched in the summer. So we had a great summer, as in the first August month, September, okay. And in a short space of time, we very quickly added 3 more properties into the portfolio. So we had 4 properties by the time we got to October. And as you'll know, Stephanie, the rent in Edinburgh is not cheap. It's quite a premium rent, a Scottish version of London's rent. And so we had big overheads. And as the summer trade kind of tailed off, we were left by Christmas time pretty much subsidizing the business. These big overheads going out, people not coming at the same volume as they do in the summer, and us not offering anything distinguishably different enough to the myriad of other service accommodation offerings. We were in a marketplace where the supply to the demand was probably imbalanced in the off season. Like any fool can make money in SA in the summer in Edinburgh. Come the autumn, the winter time, you need to know something. You need to be tapped into a bigger buying audience. You need to have a certain uniqueness of your property, perhaps. We were just vanilla type 1 and 2 bed in the city centre, neither really cheap nor really boutique and expensive. And of course, winter was flat. And so we very quickly realized that this model we have could flush a lot of cash through the system, paying an agent, paying booking.com, paying our cleaners, and paying nothing to us. So very quickly, thankfully, I realized that the unit economics of that business did not stack up, and I had to change something.
Yeah, so I recognize that because I am or have been quite negative about the old SA because of although it's got high revenues, not high cash flow, high revenue, it's also got high costs, and it can be challenging to make a profit. However, I know that that's not the case for everyone, and I'm interested in how you made it work then after that.
So with that painful experience in the winter of 2016-17, I made the decision to completely change perspective and literally put a different set of glasses on to see the landscape differently. And what I'm referring to here was to make the promise to myself that I was not going to take on a rent-to-rent property until I've got the demand sorted. In other words, until I've got booking. I'll go and find the demand and let that inform where the property is going to be. Because beforehand, I was going straight for the property. And that's what most people do. That is the biggest mistake in my view of where things go wrong, is being focused on the property first. When you switch the focus to being focused on needs and the demand first, it just melts away all the uncertainty and the worry. So that's what I did the next time around. So January, I chose I'm going to look for contractors to serve. And I went out looking for companies and companies that help contractors book accommodation. I was literally Googling and searching, and I was sending out emails and texts to make contact with people who could be potential guests until I had some traction, some contacts, some conversations. And long story short, from the very early days of the new year in 2017 into, let's say, come middle of January, late January, I had a bite and I had traction, a conversation with an organization that needed accommodation for 6 guys for 5.5 months. Thankfully, it was pretty close to where I live, right kind of area. And so I then went out looking for property. And you know what, Stephanie, my first move was to think, well, I'll never get a rent-to-rent property this quick. They need to move into a property in February. But what I can do is go and find an existing operator and essentially sell them the booking, and I'll take a little cut in the middle. And so that was my first inroad, to go and speak to operators in my area here, looking up people on Airbnb, looking up holiday let websites and contacting them. And you know what I found is that none of them had a long enough stretch of availability for 5.5 months. None of them could fulfill the need I had. But what did happen by calling around the houses is they led me on to other people that might be able to help me out, other holiday let operators, other holiday cottages, and then a farmer who had a 4-bedroom cottage coming available. And I went to go and meet with him, walk around his property. I took some pictures and reported back to my prospective client. Say, look, I can get you this property. If I put the furniture in here, then, and we've got a rough budget from them, and we charge out at this much per night. Would you take it? And I got the commitment from them first. I got a 5.5 month booking. And when I had that, I then went back to the farmer and rented the property. I then signed a lease for the rent-to-rent contract. A few days later, I had furniture in, moved 6 guys in. So from day one, it was profitable. And that started off then a whole new business, because I then built a business off the back of the same team of guys building a big biomass plant in our area. But that was the audience that it stemmed from. So that's just night and day.
I love that for so many reasons. First of all, is the tell everyone what you do. In your case, you were asking everyone for what you need, for the exact specific thing you need. But even before that, you'd taken a new perspective on it. It's not about the property, it's about it's finding the customer first.
Yeah.
And then finding the property. So I love how you did it. I loved how you restructured the business. And is that what your predictable property profit book is based upon, that model, or is it something else? I'd love to know a bit more.
It's exactly the essence that I was just communicating there, because it's become a philosophy of mine. I first learned about this approach to essentially pre-sell something before you build it through a software mentor. I built a software company, a small software company years ago. Wasn't a huge success, but I was able to start something because it was built off a degree of demand and pre-selling something. And it was those mentors I had in the software world that taught this approach and this process. And, you know, I felt so daft, Stephanie, because I learned this back in 2014. I'd started a little software business with that approach. But the whole time I was in property, I wasn't applying anything like that. It was more kind of guesswork. And so when this big, I guess, failure that I'm actually quite proud of took place in 2016, it really shone a light on, what have I done wrong here? How can I do things differently? And what came back to me in searching for answers again was, hang on, I know exactly what to do. I've been taught this approach before by 2 awesome entrepreneurs that they don't have property, but they have software businesses. I'm going to apply that same thinking to property. And so that story of 2 service accommodation businesses, the latter, which we obviously have expanded and keep running, really is the seed of this philosophy that we apply, not just in rent to rent, not just in service accommodation, but in every property strategy, in all property businesses, that same approach, the same principles. And in the book, I break it down into a nice, easy to remember model called the DICE model with 4 kind of steps to it. That's what I explain in the book. So yes, thank you for asking.
Brilliant. Well, I want to encourage people to really get their hands on that book because it's such a beautiful strategy. Your ethos, yes, fabulous. Oh, the DICE method, you've got a die on there as well. Right, okay. And yeah, and I loved how your approach came across when I first came across you on George and Sarah Choi's podcast. So shout out to them, and do check out George and Sarah's podcast as well, which is fabulous. And we have had a comment, Tsen. We're saying that is such a great tip. Thank you. You've even got a kiss there.
Pleasure.
So let's move on now, because we've got the work where it didn't work so well. Then secondly, how you really made SA work for you. And I know that you grew that quite large. So actually, before we move on, tell us a little bit about how that initial property how you moved on from that one initial property.
So off the back of identifying a rich vein of traffic, the demand source, essentially, that's what gave us the confidence to add more rent-to-rent property in a similar area. And essentially what we started to do was, after having served one particular construction site that we knew was going to have maybe a couple of years runway on it, it then led us to exploring and finding more like that. And we expanded across a stretch of motorway to have properties that were close proximity to this motorway into 2 major construction sites. and then lots in between, because we wanted to protect ourselves from the downside and mitigate risks of just one construction site dropping off after a couple of years. But it gave us that one big, I guess, flow of demand for a period of time, gave us the runway to build up a nice cash flowing business, reinvest portions of that to take out more property, pay for more furniture, and have confidence as we went about doing it that we could back ourselves, and in doing so start to build more of a database of contractors, and even some tourism as well. So the big difference between the first kind of portfolio and the second was that we weren't going for prime areas. We were going for more secondary towns, slightly bigger properties. We could have more bed spaces to sell on. So the unit economics worked better. We were having longer stays and therefore only cleaning once a week rather than 2 or 3 times a week, like in the city centre. So everything about the business model just stacked up to make it more economical. And so we were able to grow that first year. We perhaps added maybe 7 properties in, and then the next year almost doubled that again, and then started purchasing as well. So we bought some properties in the same area that fit the same model. And our balance of guests is very much, we do have a lot of summer tourism where I live in this area, but it's not a year-round thing, and it's certainly not something we build a business off. So we were focusing our trade, if you will, on construction workers coming to work on major projects, looking to fill the gaps where we could with tourism. And then later on, which is where we may take the conversation in a bit, there was the search to find more kind of corporate clients where I could build a relationship with one person and have multiple bookings come from that one relationship, if that makes sense, because that's exactly what fits the model we have.
Tell us about that, Tsen.
So coming into, so I was telling about the journey beginning the 2017 period, then end of 2018, so kind of 2 years after that, having focused predominantly on contractors and having had some of the major projects starting to come to an end, we'd already built a degree of repeat business and a bit of a database of contractors, but not enough necessarily to fill the portfolio all the time. And whilst we can get through quieter periods in winter, the whole reason for having a business obviously is to want to refine it and improve it, serve more people, and grow. Not crazy. We had no intentions of. I used to think I wanted 200 bed spaces of rent-to-rent property when we first started, right? And then I realized that would just be daft, because had I done that, head would have been well underwater. And I could have easily rented that many bed spaces in Edinburgh, but I would have got into a whole heap of trouble doing that. But instead, we were building a business off the measured, conservative approach of there being demand there. So I would never have just dumped another 5 properties all at once. It was kind of like measured. Here we go, bit at a time, sensible. But getting to 2018 Christmas time, I was aware that I wanted, again, more diversification in the portfolio to make sure that we weren't fully reliant on contractors. And so I started to reach out to the housing department of our council, because every council has got an emergency accommodation department of the housing division that will help homeless people who, by the way, there is no, I certainly had misconceptions and misinterpretations of the homeless section of society. It's not a certain type, it's not a certain stereotype at all. It's quite a range of individuals and situations and stories that are, some of them incredibly difficult and difficult situations. Others might be some of the more perhaps opportunistic of people out there, just having a bit of a free ride, but there's a whole range. Anyway, I realized there's a pretty big demand in our area after having started to probe and ask a few questions, but it took quite a bit of digging. So Christmas time 2018, I'd started to inquire with our council to make them aware of kind of properties that we had, and that we could essentially help them in the colder months if they had an excess in demand. And it never really got anywhere until March of 2019. So it took a fair bit of me kind of following up, asking again, following up, asking. Anyway, I eventually got a meeting at the council with one of the housing team leaders, which went really quite well. I was able to better understand what kind of demand they have in the area and how they work with private sector partners. Because what you might find really surprising is that all over the UK, many local authorities are spending quite significant amounts in private sector accommodation. So bed and breakfasts, guest houses, self-catered accommodation to help accommodate on a temporary basis the emergency accommodation applicants. And it's just something, I didn't know this before 2018. And again, it came from being in the right network of property people, hearing it being talked about by mentors and other investors who do already serve that market. And so by tapping into it locally, it led to a really meaningful conversations. That wasn't the first bit of business, but it was the first conversation, went positive, went very well, sorry. Second meeting followed up, and that was a more senior manager who liked what we had to say. They explained the size of their demand, essentially, that was greater than supply of property stock that they had or that they had access to in the private sector. And so we trialed our offering with 3 properties for a month booking, and it went really well. And so one thing led to the next, and it led to repeat bookings, and then gradually more properties that were being booked out to that audience. And yeah, got off to a great start, and here we are now, more than a year later, and they're a key client with us.
And again, it's like what I was saying earlier, that you didn't give up. A lot of people may have been in your exact situation when you had those properties in Edinburgh that did so well in summer and then terribly in winter, and you just realized, it wasn't working. But rather than just say, okay, service accommodation doesn't work, you then found a new market with contractors where you found the customers first, and then you found the properties to order, so to speak, and then you built that business quite big. And then not only after that, not content there, you then went on to speak to the council and develop that relationships that you could fulfill emergency housing. And just talk to us about some of the intricacies of working with the council, because I'm guessing it wasn't exactly always a smooth process.
No, certainly not. There are, I guess, certain complexities and sensitivities with the individuals that you might be working with that, yes, one needs to respect and treat with quite a bit of sensitivity. There were some horrendous situations and cases to why these people were in that circumstances. But on the same note, we experienced, myself and my operations manager, who does a lot of the guest and client contact, have had some of the most, I guess, heartfelt gratitude coming from guests in the kind of homeless sector, because our places are not luxury by any means. We are more of the kind of 2-3 star than the kind of 4 or 5 star properties, but they're brilliant properties, well kept, well cleaned, and have fairly decent furniture in the inside, etc. But the locations of them do suit quite well for being not main street with no parking and city centre stuff. It's more secondary towns, a bit of space, slightly bigger properties, space to park, etc. So it's worked great for contractors, and it's worked fairly well for this audience who kind of need that home that they don't have, or didn't, or lost, or found lost their way in some respects. But what we have had to do, Stephanie, is kind of set our stipulations as to who we're willing to work with, because we don't want to expose ourselves to the risk of antisocial behavior, drug and alcohol addictions, criminal records, etc. So from the outset, these are some of the guidelines that I set with our client partner that we're working with. And I have to take my hat off to them to say they've done an incredible job of, their caseworkers are selecting candidates that they think will be most suitable for the kind of properties that we have. They've done a brilliant job of that. And don't get me wrong, we have had some issues we have to deal with. And remember, these are guests of ours, they're not tenants. So when they do put a foot wrong, it's kind of like we'll set a 3 strikes and you're out kind of rule. They get warnings, but if they're not adhering to house rules, then they will be removed. And we haven't had to do it too many times after working with the council for over a year now. And with some of the contractors we've had wet beds, we've had smashed TVs, we've had all sorts of damage. So, you know, I think it just comes with the territory of service accommodation that you can expect a degree of headaches and problems. But to your question, people do often ask us, do you have a lot of difficulty and challenges with the audience you're working with? And we've had just as many with our contractors as we've had with our emergency accommodation guests, maybe even more so with the contractors. But it is a balancing act. We do need to do a bit more care. And well, I guess we're still in the hospitality space, but some of the individuals do need, the council often lean on us, particularly my ops manager, Louise, to almost look in on and look after some of these individuals who, if they don't hear from them for a while, we're the ones that have to go and check in on them, make sure they're okay, make sure they're still staying in the property. Our cleaners, their eyes and ears on the ground, but we play a bigger part in making that run, if that makes sense, mm-hmm. rather than them being completely self-service, come and go.
Yeah, it's a brilliant story, and I think many of us in the property space, whether owning our own portfolios or rent to rent or both, are very interested in working with in emergency housing, and I think the way that you have done it and really made it work as a partnership is great. And people can find out more about you and your processes and structures and systems for success in your book, Predictable Property Profits. I really recommend it very highly. And Tsen, we are coming into our final minutes. I feel like I've got 1,000,001 other questions that I want to ask you, but let's end on, tell us a little bit about how being a property investor has changed the game for you and for your family.
Okay. It's quite a big question, how to best answer it succinctly. So I think what I've probably recognized in becoming a property investor, it's exactly that, and what it means, it's coming back to that word become, like who is it you become through this journey. And that place I was in years ago that I was referring to, I couldn't pinpoint in the early days of my career, where I felt like I didn't belong and I was somewhat of a lost identity. Now knowing what I know and having the right kind of, I guess, emotional intelligence to look back at it, I know that the person I wanted to become was an entrepreneur. Now more specifically, an entrepreneur in property. And so doing what I do each day and identifying and solving problems and adding value to people's lives through property as the main vehicle, that's what I've found I love doing. That's what brings me meaning and satisfaction and that degree of freedom that people strive for, to have choice. And you know, this little office that I'm in is in my home. This is where I've worked since 2014. And I've got the freedom to come and go from this place of work as and when, and run sometimes this time of year we'd be in Spain for 3 weeks with my wife's side, the family who live out there. We're not this year because of the COVID situation, but that aside, it means a huge amount of freedom, choice, and meaning. The whole journey of what life is for me is this continuous journey of trying to become the best version of me as a husband, as a father, as a business person, and property is that vehicle through which I can do that, which I love it so much.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic answer, Tsen. I really feel a lot the same way, that I've become such a different person through running our business and having to become a leader. And and it's constantly, there are different barriers and obstacles and challenges, and yeah, I've really come to love that process, and I know that you have as well, just the way that you've described getting over the various obstacles that you've come into. And the second thing the second pleasure that we get from running these businesses is that we have more than we need, and we're able to give back in our communities. And I know that you are actually doing it as part of the work you do, that you're providing housing for people who really, really struggle to find, good quality housing by people who care. And I can hear just the way that you describe things, that you really do care about the people that you're working with. Is there anything that you would like to leave people with, a final piece of maybe advice for getting started?
Okay, so I guess a final piece of advice might be, well, I think it's probably best to, if I'm going to simplify it and give a message of where to get started, is don't go about getting started through guesswork. Don't do what I did when I first got into rent-to-rent service accommodation and base your decisions and moves on guesswork and assumption. This might happen, this might happen. You know what, I'll tell you what, Stephanie, I'll refer to a quote here. If anyone's seen that classic film, The Field of Dreams, where there's this line, if you build it, they will come. Yeah. Well, I relate that back to property a lot, because if you build it, they might come and they might not. And if they don't, yeah, you might lose your shirt. So I'd much rather pivot that to saying something like, well, if they buy it, then build it. Or if you can pre-sell it, then build it. So in other words, go out, folks, and find the demand first in whatever you're going to do, whether it's a service-based business or a product-based business or a property business.
Yeah.
Go and figure out, first of all, who's going to pay for the property, and then go and provide the property solution. And it will iron out and take away the fear, the uncertainty, the where to start, the don't know how. It all just makes everything so much easier when you start from that end user.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you, Tsen, for joining us today on the podcast, sharing your wisdom and your insights and your methods. If you're watching or listening, I do encourage you, and you're interested, I'm sure you will be, I do encourage you to buy Tsen's book, Predictable Property Profit.
Predictable Property Profit. There we go.
Predictable Profits. And if you just want to find out more about this wonderful man, then you can go over to his website, devenirplus.co.uk. So it's devenirplus.co.uk. And we'll also get the links in the show notes and under the video. Oh, you've had a few other comments that I want to call out. Thank you, Tsen. Your journey is inspiring. Well done. And someone else has said, great advice. Thank you. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Tsen, rather, for joining us, and thank you also for watching and listening. And for now, it's the end of another episode, so it's goodbye from Tsen Wharton.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, and it's goodbye from me. I will see you next time.